You're listening to a podcast from the BBC World Service. This is Hardtalk with me, Stephen Sacker. Thanks for downloading this edition of the programme. I do hope you enjoy it. Welcome to Hardtalk on the BBC World Service with me, Stephen Sacker. My guest today spent a decade at the very heart of the American security and intelligence establishment. Michael Hayden was director of the National Security Agency, America's top-secret center of electronic surveillance, when Osama bin Laden launched his attack on the United States on 9/11. In the aftermath, Hayden supervised an unprecedented expansion of internet and phone surveillance, which was only exposed by the revelations of Edward Snowden. In 2006, Hayden was appointed director of the CIA and served in that post till the end of George W. Bush's presidency. It was a period marked by bitter controversy over the CIA's use of extraordinary rendition, detention without trial, and so-called enhanced interrogation techniques, otherwise known to many as torture. The CIA also launched a campaign of drone strikes on suspected terrorist targets, which was inherited and expanded upon by the Obama administration. Does this record represent a clear-eyed response to the threat of international jihadist terror, or a counterproductive reaction which fatally undermined America's claim to the moral high ground? Well, Michael Hayden joins me now. Welcome to Hard Talk.
Thanks, Stephen.
Almost 15 years on from 9/11, you have been intimately involved with the so-called war on terror. Today, would you acknowledge that the war on terror failed?
No, I wouldn't say failed. I would freely admit we're less safe right now than we were 4 or 5 years ago, but we are collectively more safe than we were on September 10th, 2001.
Really? Even though we now see a group that call themselves Islamic State, who aren't just intent on hitting the West, but actually control swathes of territory and have money and materiel and men that Al-Qaeda couldn't even have dreamed of.
No, I take your point, and that's all true. I answer the question, frankly, as an American, in terms of threats to North America. I think that's somewhat true, not as much, with regard to threats to Europe. But the Middle East is in chaos. I mean, I agree with you. We have a terrorist state the size of a pretty good-sized American state in the middle of the Middle East, not in the middle of nowhere like Afghanistan, but straddling all the historic trade routes of a very important region of the world. Yeah, that's a big deal.
And expanding, because of course there are bases in Syria and Iraq, but we now know that thousands of extreme jihadists are penetrating Libya,
right,
using Libya as a new base.
No, absolutely correct. So, no, I get it. It has gotten worse, yes.
I asked the question about failure, not just in terms of the potent threat posed by jihadists, but also because of what seems to me a real problem the United States has in terms of perception. And I want to quote to you words from a senior lawyer who's worked with some of the quote-unquote victims of U.S. security policy since 9/11. He's a guy called Clive Stafford Smith. He said this: on September the 12th, the day after the 9/11 attacks, 2001, there was widespread international sympathy for the United States. But we in the U.S. responded in a way that threw away our values. We came to be viewed as hypocrites, and hypocrisy breeds hatred. Do you accept some of that?
No, I don't, certainly not in that extreme form. We in the military, particularly in the American military, talk about the close fight and the deep fight. In the war on terror, the close fight is, what do you do with the jihadist that's already committed to come kill you and your family? All right? And then you've got the deep fight. The deep fight has to do with the production rate of those who might want to come kill me and my family in 3, 5, or 10 years. I actually think we've been pretty successful in the close battle, okay, in dealing with the immediate threat. We have been far less successful, and I think that's some of the things being suggested here, far less successful with the deep fight. And I freely admit, the way you fight the close fight actually can affect the final outcome of the deep fight. We get to targeted killings, okay? I actually support that. I think it's absolutely necessary for the close battle.
Targeted killings, some people call them extrajudicial executions.
Right.
You could call them assassinations.
Well, I
the
know,
drone strikes and
actually,
taking
some
out...
people do, but I actually call it making war against an opposing armed enemy force. All right? So we've had targeted killings. I think the immediate effect of those have been actually positive. These are people who want to come kill us. Stephen, we always knew there were second and third order effects. Second and third order effects like it feeds the jihadist recruitment narrative. Second and third order effects like it truly does alienate even our good friends whose legal theory doesn't match our legal theory. I mean, the theme of the book, all right, is that this is a perpetual, eternal gray area, and that all of these decisions are very difficult. So I freely admit we may have gotten it wrong. That's why I actually point out that
well,
with regard to
let's not hedge it. We may have got it wrong. Let's talk specifics, and let me ask you if you did get it wrong. Because the book you're talking about, your memoir, it's a fascinating read. It talks about your 10 years, 10 years running first the National Security Agency and then the CIA, intimately involved in a series of the most controversial issues. If we just take two, I would point to your decision to undertake a new level of mass electronic surveillance when you were at NSA, and then when you were at CIA, dealing with the fallout of rendition, detention,
interrogations,
and torture. Now, these are really big deals.
Right.
Your memoir is called Playing to the Edge, the idea being that you push as far as you can to the very maximum legal limit to fight the terrorists.
Right.
I would put it to you, you didn't play to the edge of the line, you crossed the line.
Well, obviously we disagree. There are lines, all right? There are some things that even when you're in exigent circumstances that you don't do. You don't do because of ethical and legal concerns, but you don't do because it hurts you over the long term. So we had to make these decisions, all right? These are tough decisions. But frankly, broadly speaking, I'm comfortable with the decisions we made. I'm comfortable that we made ourselves, and let me add, we made our allies safer. Despite allied concern over how we may have gotten some information, let me tell you a conversation that never happened. I never called an intelligence chief somewhere else in the world and said, friend, I've got some threat information I want to pass on to you. The next line I never heard was, well, Mike, before you do that, I really need to know how you got it. No one ever gave me that response.
You didn't say to these friends, by the way, friend, I'm also spying on you, which you were doing to Angela Merkel, to President Rousseff in Brazil, to a whole bunch of people that you called your close friends, but were in fact people you were spying on.
Well, first of all, I'm not going to comment on any specific operational activity, but I will offer you the view that any intelligence service in the world will go out and try to learn information to make their citizens safer.
If we stick right now to this question of electronic surveillance, which you took some big decisions. I mean, it was your decision to launch the Stellar Wind program at NSA, which took the storage and analysis of ordinary people's telephone communications to a new level. Now, the line you crossed there was that you were doing this, you said, because you needed to know if anybody in the United States was talking to bad guys outside the United States, but you never informed the American public that this is what you were doing. And that was fundamentally contrary to the Constitution.
No, actually it's not, all right? We did acquire telephone records from American telecommunications providers. We did store those records at Fort Meade. We didn't analyze those records for American telephone activity. The only approach we ever made to those records, Stephen, is when we had what we believed to be a dirty number, a terrorist number, almost always a foreign number. And all we did was simply to query that, admittedly, massive database, right? Has anyone in that database actually been in contact with what we now know to be is a terrorist number? And here we're in New York, all right? And if a number in the Bronx, I'm speaking metaphorically, kind of raises its hand and says, well, yeah, I actually talk to it every Thursday. We then get to ask the number in the Bronx, who did you talk to? That's it. That's the extent of the stellar wind metadata
had no
program.
idea that you were storing their telephone records, and you opened the floodgates to everything that we now know, thanks to Edward Snowden, about all the different programs. They were called PRISM, Tempora, all sorts of other programs, which basically allowed you in the intelligence, the spying community, to gather information about ordinary people's email, their electronic communication, and they had no idea.
We didn't tell the American people. You know, we've had our scandals in the past.
You should have done, shouldn't you?
Well,
you
actually, on balance, we should have been more transparent. But let me explain to you how this works in our democracy. Okay, the great compromise of the 1970s was that espionage, which historically had been the province only of the executive, that we Americans would try, Stephen, a grand experiment. We would actually expand our oversight of espionage to the other political branch, our Congress, and even to our court system in some specific circumstances. By the way.
But in secret.
Yes.
The public wasn't allowed to listen to any cross-examination.
Hear me out. We are still the only Western democracy that does even that. And the great compromise was espionage, which is a process that demands secrecy for success, would be overseen by all the political branches in the United States government. And that was the social contract that we arrived at. So
the point is, it may have been a contract with politicians behind closed doors. It wasn't a contract with the American people. And Edward Snowden, frankly, did America a huge favor, did he not, when he exposed this to the full glare of public view.
Let me run the tape.
You called him a traitor.
I don't think I have. I actually said he was a defector, and he was the cause of the single greatest hemorrhaging of American secrets, legitimate American secrets, in the history of the Republic.
And one final electronic surveillance point, and then we must move on. Right now, there is a big debate in the United States about encryption. The kind of complete, full-on, end-to-end encryption that Apple, for example, are now using, and which has become controversial because Apple has not unencrypted a particular telephone belonging to a particular individual who was involved in a mass shooting in California. Yeah. Donald Trump says that Apple should be boycotted until they unencrypt. Is this a profound problem today for American intelligence, that encryption, thanks to what we learned from Edward Snowden, has become so sophisticated that you guys can't crack it?
This is a perpetual gray area, Stephen. This is not about the forces of light and the forces of darkness. All right? This is about trying to balance two things, both of which are virtues: freedom, security, liberty, safety. Now, in this particular case, it might surprise you. I'm with Apple. End-to-end encryption is good.
Let us move on to your responsibilities when you were head director of the CIA. You inherited a profound mess in the CIA. A lot of it was connected to fallout from the invasion of Iraq. We saw the CIA involved in what were called extraordinary renditions, sending suspected Al-Qaeda sympathizers to so-called black site prisons where they were tortured, where the CIA...
Torture is your word, okay?
Well, let's talk about that. Yeah. Waterboarding. It is now clear that those in the United States Congress, at least those in the Intelligence Committee of the Senate, which wrote a full report on this, regarded that as brutal, regarded it as torture, and regarded you as having been, shall we say, economical with the truth in your presentation of it. Well, why don't you now come clean and say, yeah, we tortured?
No, to be precise with language, it wasn't the Senate Intelligence Committee. It was the Democrats on the Senate Intelligence Committee. And there was a Republican report that rebutted the Senate Democrats' conclusion.
You, I think, at one point said that it caused minimum discomfort, waterboarding.
No, I never would have said it that way. But look, waterboarding is a very harsh technique. Now, just so everyone understands, and we keep coming back to the issue.
Why can't you say the word torture?
Because torture is a legal term, Stephen. And, you know, and although we use it casually, you may use it casually in your profession. I can't use it casually in mine, all right? And so let's frame this, all right? CIA held 115 or so folks. About a third of them had any techniques at all used against them. And of those people, 3 were waterboarded, and the last person waterboarded was in March of 2003. I became director in May of 2006. I spent the summer of 2006 arguing within the administration that although this program continued to have value, we needed to modify it. And one of the modifications, Stephen, was to tell all members of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, not just the congressional leadership. And I won that argument.
In 2011, you said this to the BBC in an interview, I believe for the Panorama program, referring to the extraordinary rendition in the black sites where some suspects, prisoners ended up. You said, quote, "We did not send these people there to be mistreated."
No, we didn't.
Of course you knew they were going to be mistreated. I mean, that was the whole point of sending them to the prisons in Syria, in Poland, in God knows where, because you felt there.
So in the book, I have this conversation with the Vice President-elect of the United States. I'm there with the President-elect and the Vice President-elect in December 2008 in Chicago, briefing the new soon-to-be president on all covert actions. At which point, the Vice President interrupts and says, "Oh, come on, General, you sent those people there to be roughed up." At which point I turned to the Vice President and said, "Mr. Vice President, that is not correct. We are under, Stephen, a moral and legal responsibility in terms of how those people were treated after the rendition has been completed." Now, by the way, just so we have a complete record here.
If I may say so, your book is all about, you know, how you played to the edge but didn't cross it. Your answer suggests to me that you didn't cross what you defined as the edge because you simply moved the line.
Oh, no.
To encompass torture.
I don't create the line. The line is created in a democracy by the American political process. And in this particular case, what we did was approved by the Department of Justice, authorized by the President, and briefed to the Congress. Now, honest men can differ that they didn't like where that line was drawn. But you have, even honest men have to admit, a democracy has to make a decision, and that was the decision our democracy made. You're kind of attacking the decision-making process here in the United States. And what I'm telling you is that some of these things, not all, but an awful lot of these things, continue to cross two administrations very different in their orientation.
Well, and that point is absolutely relevant to drone strikes. You called them, quote, "the most precise application of firepower in the history of armed conflict." It's quite a claim. Unfortunately, isn't borne out by reality.
It isn't borne out by some claims.
Well, you know, do you not take seriously the research work done by Stanford University and New York University looking on the ground, for example, in the tribal areas of Pakistan, in Afghanistan, at what actually happens when drone strikes are ordered? There's one very detailed study from northeast Afghanistan in 2012-13 of more than 200 people killed, only 35 were the intended targets.
That statement doesn't comport with any reality with which I am familiar. And let me be modestly harsh and pushing back here a little bit. Did any of those institutions have full-run streaming video of the target hours before, during, and after the attack? I don't think so.
But that's a video that's miles up in the sky. That doesn't tell you who's actually died. It doesn't reveal whether men, women, and children who were not terrorists were actually in the building or in the car.
It does reveal whether they were men, women, or children. You've got a platform that gives you a God's eye continuous view of the target for hours or days if you want it. You have signals intelligence, which you've described its power in some of your previous questions, that is used to confirm the presence of who it is you think is actually there. And also, you've got penetrations of the Al-Qaeda network that give you granular information on the nature of a target or a compound.
I understand what you're saying. I also understand that, exactly. I also understand that you can repeatedly get it wrong. For example, the wedding party in Yemen where 14 civilians were blown away, driving away from a wedding.
I have no personal knowledge of that. That is something that happened after I left government. But to come back
the most precise application of firepower in the history of armed conflict? Who's going to believe that in the Middle East today?
Stephen, it's compared to what? A B-52, a B-2, a fast-moving F-16, indirect fire from 122mm mortars, or howitzers, or field guns? I mean, this is relative in relative terms. And I think the statement stands.
We're almost out of time. Just a specific point, which is about the big picture intelligence strategy of the United States. An academic called Steve Walt, who's been critical of the United States and its Mideast policymaking and its intelligence and security policy for many years, he says, look, the 15 years of war on terror have been as unsuccessful as the United States war on drugs. And he said that part of the reason is that some of our basic premises are wrong. For example, he says, you know, our alliance and partnership and faith in Saudi Arabia as a fundamental ally of the United States is wrong-headed. And our view of Iran has for a long time been unhelpful, because we have to find a way to cooperate with Iran, not simply regard it as an enemy. On those two specific points, Saudi and Iran, where do you sit today?
There are elements of Saudi society, and there are elements of Saudi policy that I think are counter to the interest not only of Saudi Arabia, but to the United States. That is not to say
contrary to the interests of the United States.
That is not to say that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is not a friend of the United States of America. But what I am telling you is that the Wahhabist theology, philosophy, has been allowed to flourish post-1979, and that does complicate the issue. I actually do not see the coincidence between American interest and Iranian interest in the Middle East. I actually think the Iranians want to be a hegemonic power over the Sunni states in the region. Kissinger summarizes this wonderfully. He says the Iranians have to decide whether or not they are a country or a cause. I think we negotiated with them on the nuclear deal as if they were a country. Since the nuclear deal, they have acted as if they were a cause, and that is very problematic.
You wanted, I think, to play something of a role in the current U.S. presidential election. You chose to be an advisor for
Governor
Jeb
Bush. Right.
He's just dropped out of the race.
He has.
So my last question is going to be about where America's foreign policy is going today, and we have to view it in the context of a presidential race where a lot of the heat and light and noise is coming from Donald Trump, some on the left coming from Bernie Sanders, essentially coming from people who appear to want to adopt a much more isolationist, a much more protectionist, a much less global and open U.S. foreign policy.
So,
you worried?
Oh, my goodness, yes. I am worried.
Because you
worried about
say,
some of the things being said in the campaign.
You say, my message to the next president is get involved and stay involved in the world. Yeah. Jeb Bush has just imploded. Right. That kind of old-school Republican sort of...
Republican internationalism is the word you're looking for.
Well, okay, you can call it that if you want. But frankly, that is not where the American people are today.
Well,
it's not where America is today.
Actually, I don't know whether that's true, but that is affected by the amount of personal and political capital a sitting president would put in to wanting to be an internationalist. And frankly, President Obama, and this is not meant as a criticism, it's just a description, President Obama has decided that he wants to spend his personal and political capital more internally than externally. That's why you get it's time to do nation building at home. But to summarize...
Well, if you think that may be turning away from the world, what do you make of Donald Trump?
Oh, I have my deep concerns. If he governs consistent with some of the things he said in the campaign, I would be very concerned.
Michael Hayden, we have to end there, but thank you very much. That was an edition of Hard Talk presented by me, Stephen Sacker. For details of our complete range of podcasts and our terms of use, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.